Time now for the weigh-in right here on the MMA Hour, and it actually is not anything related to Bellator. I know some folks were talking about, was the main event fixed? We're actually going to get to that ridiculous argument in the Monday Morning Analyst, which will be a little bit later in the show. But there was something else that kind of got brought up on the news cycle. I think it came from a TMZ interview. I try not to watch too much TMZ. Although they do break news. Anyway, Ronda Rousey made some news, and I believe she was asked about what had happened with Conor and Khabib and the melee, and she took a broader point. I believe we have her quote. If we could put that on the screen, I would love to see it and love to read it as well. What do we have here? Yes? Here we go. Here is what she wrote. I'll read it out if you can't see it. I think that Khabib jumping out of the octagon was not as bad as throwing objects at a bus, because my friend Rose Namajunas was on that bus. My friend Michael Chiesa missed his fight, of course he'll be on the show a little bit later, because he suffered an injury from broken glass. And here is really the bigger point. She says, I just feel like there has to be equal treatment all the way across the board. I don't think that anyone should get special treatment because they're a bigger draw. Now, this naturally drew some chuckles from everyone, because if oh, Jesus. Danny, I'll get back to you in a second. Just give me 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. Naturally, this drew chuckles from everybody, because they're saying, well, if anyone benefited from unequal treatment, it was her. Now, there's a couple of points here I want to make, because some folks pushed back on it, right? Look, in some ways, Rousey's really not unique. I mean, she is. Let's be clear about that. But in some ways, she's really not. Here's the reality, and I think a lot of folks are missing some of the context here. I made a point that when she said this, I wrote on Twitter, like, that is rich coming from her, right? Somebody who really benefited from preferential treatment. And folks were saying, my colleague Jeff Wagenheim, I love Jeff, he disagreed with me, which is always great. I love having a debate. And he tried to make the point, like, look, there's one thing if you're Conor and you're chucking furniture at a bus window and literally breaking laws, going to jail, versus maybe skipping out on some media obligations. They're not really the same. And my response would be, you're right. They're not the same, which is why the comparison is really, really, really important to make here. Here's the truth. What did Rousey get in the way of preferential treatment? Probably a number of things, including but not limited to the fact that at UFC 207, she did not have to engage with the media or Joe Rogan virtually in any capacity whatsoever. And you're going to say, well, big deal. She doesn't have to talk to the media. I even said during that time, I don't feel like personally she owes me anything. But you'll recall Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz were supposed to fight at UFC 200. That got yanked because Conor didn't want to do enough media. And of course, that's how they ended up on UFC 202. In other words, she got treatment all the way back then that Conor McGregor couldn't get in a roughly similar time frame. And he was one of the biggest stars in the sport. That should tell you something, that they were willing to bend over backwards for her in ways they weren't for him. So it's not necessarily that was the biggest ask in the world, although it was pretty substantial, but rather the tone they took, the approach they took that was so dramatically unequal. And there's a couple other things you could point to as well in terms of, the way in which they pushed her and promoted her. You'll recall that the lack of her doing any kind of media, I would argue, dramatically hurt Amanda Nunes, right? When your opponent never has to talk to the media and your opponent is the hugely celebrated, popular one, and they never have to speak to anybody about you. They never have to mention your name. They never have to acknowledge you. They never have their name never has to come. Your name never has to come out of their mouth. None of these things ever have to have any kind of reality. And as a consequence, people just never paid attention to Amanda. And so I really believe that was supposed to be a passing of the torch moment. It's not just that she didn't talk to the media. No one treats us as victims. I'm not asking us to, or I'm not asking you to, rather. But sorry, Amanda Nunes was very much a victim in that, and that never got addressed. That's not really all that fair to be quite candid with you. And you could point to a number of other things, and folks have said, well, what does that got to do with Conor chucking Nadal at a bus? Here's the reality. It's a difference in degree. It's not a difference in kind, folks. When the UFC, there's some historical perspective that's required here, and I'm going to sound like Clint Eastwood, sans the racism, in Gran Turismo, telling all the kids to get off his lawn. But it's true. If you followed the UFC from the moment they began to flex their muscles, you did see preferential treatment all the way back then, but it was a little bit different. So, in other words, what would it include? It would include things like, before it got taken away, Matt Hughes and Chuck Liddell being set up for life. It would include, to some degree, the way the contracts were set up, right? Like, yes, someone who is headlining a UFC show and fighting for a title should make more. But in and of itself, there's no negotiated union setting up standards or best practices for the fighter, so there's really unequal treatment there. Again, some of that's justified, some of that's not. You could go to some other things, right? Like Gilbert Melendez negotiating in certain things from Bellator offering a contract. But most of it was fairly minimal, fairly low-key. And here's what happened. When the UFC was powerful and flexing their muscles, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to be anything other than a partner and to have a degree of subservience to them. And you were rewarded for that. When the business began to flag a little bit and the stars began to get a little more powerful, then you'll notice there was a ratcheting up of how much preferential treatment and accommodation took place. Dating all the way back to what Rousey got was some things. And it's not the worst of it. But you got to recall, how about Brock Lesnar getting his USADA requirements for his UFC 200 fight waived? That was accommodation. And it's accommodation I don't know that would have necessarily happened all the way back in a bit of a different era. How about the fact that CM Punk fought in the UFC at all? I mean, this is the height of accommodation. And it was a move that was done to shore up their flagging year to a degree. He was brought in to kind of help these efforts in a way that made no sense other than he was willing to do it and he was needed for some kind of financial consideration. So you have this, what I would call fairly modest escalation of accommodation to the point where you get to Conor McGregor literally breaking the law and that something should be done about it. You can say that there's well, one is minor and one is major. Dude, it's all part of the same continuum. And one accommodation has given rise to every other escalating accommodation. You cannot disconnect the two. To the extent the UFC had all the leverage, they made some accommodations for people who were better for business, or they made some kind of concessions. And to the extent that star power got greater, they made more. And to the extent that their business began to flag a little bit, or at least their relationship to the consumer as the primary driver of quality began to diminish and began to all the power used to be transferred to the stars, and then you saw more and more and more accommodation. But it's the same impulse. It's the same impulse to say, we'll treat you like X, we'll treat you like Y. Now, Conor just forced their hand because he was so popular, he is so good for business, he is so beloved by so many parts of the world, and the UFC as a brand doesn't have the same kind of fan loyalty that it once did. But they are not separate. They are not separate. They are absolutely, unequivocally tied at the hip. And you can say, if you were in Rousey's position, well, wouldn't you want the accommodations if you needed them? Well, yeah, of course. Everybody is going to want whatever they want in this world. They're going to want to get a raise. They're going to want to have 100 days off a year. They're going to want all these things. It's just up to the people in power to make choices about whether or not that's deserved, about what kind of message that sends to the rest of the company. Here's the reality. Fighters doing what's in their self-interest is just something that's always going to be that way. Take for another example, if Daniel Cormier was offered to fight, I don't know, Mariusz Pudzianowski, the strongman or something, or pick somebody else who's a big bodybuilder who's famous, Larry Wheels or something, right? Cormier would win. right? But let's say they were going to pay him a ton of money to do it. He's going to take it because it's in his self-interest. Rousey asking for that, it's in her self-interest, or at least so she thought. There's a question about that. I'm not necessarily mad about that instinct that she has. My issue is not that. My issue is, number one, when you are a contributor to a sliding scale of how justice is meted out, how it's distributed, and how it's distributed unequally, you don't get to lament that sliding scale. You're part of the problem. You can rationalize all the things that she or Gilbert or Brock or CM Punk or Chuck Liddell and Matt Hughes, all these favors that they got, all this favoritism that they got, you can rationalize that, but you can't divorce their role in this erosion of standards either. They're connected. They're absolutely connected. And so to me, when I see things like that, I'm like, look, I get it. She didn't chuck a bus or a hand truck, a dolly at a bus. She didn't do any of those things, nor am I suggesting she should. Nor am I suggesting she should be thrown under the bus, metaphorically speaking, for any of the things that she had. But there is absolutely unequal treatment in the UFC. Yes, it's been around for a while, but it's gotten way worse over time as the stars get more popular and the brand gets less. And as the fighters begin to ask more, they begin to get more. And it didn't just start with Conor. Maybe he took it to the furthest degree. Maybe he abused that privilege. Maybe you could say he took it to a degree that is absurd. And I would agree with you. But this idea that this all started with Conor and he's the one that has really changed the way business is done? No, he's the one that shed a light on it. Before you could sort of you could squint and maybe you couldn't see it anymore. That's not that way anymore, man. And it didn't start with him. It went all the way back, and she benefited from that system the entire time. Now, she pulled her weight too. She made millions, and I'm glad. I hope she makes even more millions doing what she's doing with the WWE. Good for her, man. I really have no issue with it. But Conor gets a lot of criticism. Some of it fair, some of it not so fair. And he absolutely has been a beneficiary of the UFC's uneven distribution of justice. No doubt about it. But here's the reality, man. He ain't the architect of that system. He's just the latest engineer.